And now it's my pleasure to introduce our keynote speaker today. And I'm going to ask that you look around you, dear friends. You are sheltered. You live in comfort. You are free from war, free of intolerance, and we are free, too, of conflict at this time. But at other times, we forget the gratitude owed to those who created a society in which religion and secular governance exist in harmony. And I ask, was it always so? As early as 622, the struggles that face us today began in Europe, and thousands of Christians raised the battle cry, calling out, "God wills it." And centuries passed while those battles waxed and waned until 1095. Many others followed. Today, on foreign soil, several million square miles of it, from the Mediterranean to Pakistan, where most of the world's religions began, religious strife has become epidemic, and it is accelerating. It has recently been estimated that 100,000 Christians are dying every year. Imagine, that is 11 every hour. They are dying for their faith. Now, what greater price will we pay? The European Parliament has declared the killing of Christians genocide. The European Union has called for the creation of a special representative for freedom of religion in the world. They ask, and I quote, "Who will take up the undeniable evidence of this genocide?" Perhaps our own crusader advocate, a man whose lifetime of service to the defense of religious liberty here in America and around the world is without peer. Jay Sekulow is the chief counsel of the American Center for Law and Justice, as well as for the European Center. As a defender of fundamental human rights and religious freedom, he has fought from our Supreme Court to Europe's Court of Human Rights for the liberty of mankind to pursue their religious beliefs. He is also an active broadcaster, co-hosting both radio and television programming with his sons, Jordan and Logan. He has been honored many times for his advocacy and was named by the National Law Journal as one of the 100 most influential lawyers in America. In 2014, he was awarded the Patriarch Athenagoras Human Rights Award on behalf of the Order of St. Andrew the Apostle, protectors of the Ecumenical Patriarchate in Constantinople. He shares this great honor with Archbishop Desmond Tutu, Mother Teresa, Mikhail Gorbachev, and our own President George H.W. Bush, along with Mrs. Barbara Bush. Today, he will share with us his determination to defend at all costs mankind's right to religious freedom. Jay Sekulow.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you for that kind introduction. Everybody always leaves out of the introduction that my first job out of law school was a prosecutor for the Internal Revenue Service, which actually later served me well in another matter. Your Eminence, distinguished clergy, archons, friends, thanks for having me. I look forward to being with you for months, and I'm thrilled to be in Naples to share with you something that I think we all are concerned about. The issue is genocide. So let me tell you a little bit about my own family's relationship to that topic. My grandfather came to the United States in 1914. He was Russian. He was 14 years old, Jewish, and was being persecuted. Entire villages were wiped out. The world, for a long time, was silent. My grandfather, Shmulik, his English version of his name is Sam, but it was Shmulik Sekulow, came on the George Washington, crossed the Atlantic through Ellis Island, and at age 31, he became a citizen of the United States. My daughter-in-law, Amanda, found my grandfather's naturalization papers and the court's order on Ancestry.com. And they have it displayed in their home. And the interesting aspect of that is not only the order itself, but that my son, Logan, that would be Shmulek's great-grandson, has the exact same penmanship, exact same handwriting. My grandfather was a fruit peddler in Brooklyn, New York. He spoke 5 languages, but was a fruit peddler. Didn't go to high school. But his grandson, me, I get to argue cases at the Supreme Court of the United States and cases around the globe. So I don't hesitate in talking about the United States with the ideal of American exceptionalism. Doesn't mean we're the only country that operates as a freedom-loving country. I think that's innate to mankind. But the reality is, I experienced it. Now, I was with the Archons in Berlin. It was 2 years ago. And I don't talk about my mother's family that often. That's because they were not Russian, they were German. In fact, my grandmother, my mother's mother's last name was Fuhrer. They were from Germany, doctors, lawyers. That entire side of my family, except for my grandmother and her brother, were wiped out in the Holocaust. Completely eliminated in the Holocaust. So I come to the topic of genocide with deep understanding and concern. My cousin did a family documentary, a book, of my mother's side of the family with unbelievable detail. My great-great-grandmother, Golda, has a namesake now, and that is her great-great-great-great-granddaughter is named for her. We have a Golda and a Georgia. We're about to have a Sophie. And then my grandson is Riker. You know, I used to say that before I had grandchildren that when I argue those cases at the Supreme Court of the United States, they start the court the same way they have since the time the court first sat. They call the case name and then they say, oyez, 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 the Honorable Supreme Court of the United States is now in session. God save the United States in this honorable court. And then they would say, Mr. Sekulow, we'll now hear from you. And I would say, no, Mr. Sekulow, the grandson of Shmulek. And I would say, we'll now hear from me. So that used to be my favorite thing to be called, Mr. Sekulow at the Supreme Court of the United States. I do have to confess that my favorite thing to be called now is Paw Paw by my grandchildren. But we live in a very trying time. 2 years ago, Andy Economo and I went to study at Oxford. We've done that now for 3 years. We're about to do our 4th year. We take a period of time and we participate in Oxford-style symposium, papers, and the program I was in, that Andy was in, was at Exeter College, and mine was dealing with the subject of strife in the Middle East. And this was just before ISIS made the national headlines. I mean, months before. And the person that was in charge of our program was an Iranian Baha'i who left Iran during the Islamic Revolution. He was a professor, and he ended up being a professor at Oxford. Very left of center politically, a bit of a peacenik. I'm not using that in a disparaging way, but he believed, for instance, in the Middle East that Israel and Hamas could negotiate out a truce. He asked me, he invited Andy and I to go to the Fellows Garden, which in Oxford is not only an honor, but it's almost illegal if you're not a fellow of that college. And we were fellows of another college, but not that one. But he invited us, and we went, and we sat down and talked. And he said, Mr. Sekulow, what are you going to do your presentations on? I said, ISIS. He said, ISIS. So this was a guy, I read everything he had written since 1980 in preparation for this program at Oxford. So I spent months reading, watched every interview he gave that was available on YouTube. Hundreds of hours, probably 1,000 hours of research. And I knew he was a peacenik and that he believes you can negotiate out anything. And he said ISIS, and we were talking about it, and I said, well, Professor Dr. Jeanapur, how would you handle ISIS? Now, the expectation, of course, was reason, negotiation. He said how I would handle ISIS: crush them. And this was coming from the peacenik. It reminded me of a quote by Benjamin Disraeli when he was dealing with, as Prime Minister of Israel, he was dealing with Russian aggression. Nothing new. I think this quote would work today. He said, questions between Russia and England are not questions that can be settled by arbitration. They are questions in which power is involved, and power is only met by power. Questions of this kind can only be settled by force. He later said that, of course, by saying force, I don't mean that diplomacy shouldn't be part of it. But diplomacy without the power of force is no diplomacy at all. Winston Churchill, following on this theme, talking about conflict with the Turks, something we can relate to. It was very interesting. Churchill, early in his career, understood what he was up against. And as World War I developed and Turkish aggression was aggressive, the French foreign minister said to Churchill, who was then in the Foreign Office, the United Kingdom, said, the French representative said, we will stop the Turks by diplomacy. To which Churchill said, my good minister, the British replied to your diplomacy, and the Turkish response to diplomacy would only be worthy if it includes our bayonets. Winston Churchill. The current administration, I don't want to get too political in a season that is very political, but it ties right into the issue of genocide. Our current administration, the President said, it's time for leadership. In contrasting the leadership of Russia, President Obama said, if you think that running your economy into the ground and having to send troops in order to prop up your only ally in leadership, talking about Syria, then we've got a different definition of leadership. My definition of leadership would be leading on climate change. Now, I'm not going to get into the debate on climate change, and I think that I'll leave that to the scientists, and I'll leave that to others, and I understand the importance of the climate and the ecology. But to say we are in a conflict of this proportion and that we should worry about climate change as the number one priority ignores the fundamental definition of what constitutes genocide. When you look at what's happening by ISIS, let's start with the definition. Genocide is the intent to systematically eliminate a cultural, ethnic, linguistic, national, racial, or religious group. Genocide has been codified as illegal since World War II under what's called customary international law. Since 2002, the International Criminal Court in The Hague can, under certain circumstances, prosecute genocide. Lord Jonathan Sacks, former chief rabbi of the United Kingdom, said the real clash of the 21st century will not be inter-civilization, but civilization as we know it, Western civilization, against religion. And then he was very specific. With the rise of radical political Islam, our world has become suddenly more dangerous, not only to Jews and Christians and other religious minorities, but even to Muslims who disagree with the jihadists. The truth is, there is an unholy alliance operating right now today. And it has two faces. There is the unholy alliance of ISIS, Boko Haram, and Al-Qaeda. And then there is these are non-nation states. And then there is the unholy alliance of nation states, Iran, Russia, Syria. We have a crisis, a world clash, a crisis that has reached, you read it about on the front page of every paper in the world. Resolutions are passed condemning it. Unfortunately, the United States of America has been leading from behind, and that has not worked out very well. Our enemies do not fear us, and our friends do not trust us. We are witnessing the eradication of Christianity within the ancient homes of Christianity. The safest place to be a Christian in the Middle East today is the Jewish state, Israel. Now, I want you to think about that for a moment. The safest place to be a Christian today in the Middle East is Israel. Because if you're a Coptic Christian in Egypt, it's not safe. If you are an Orthodox Christian in Syria or Iraq, it is not safe. And by the way, we could talk about denominational differences, and I'm thrilled to see such a wide representation of clergy here. But let me tell you this, as someone that wrote the first book on ISIS, before ISIS became a household name. I wrote a book called The Rise of ISIS. It was based on our papers in Oxford. And I compared ISIS to Hamas. And the reason I compared ISIS to Hamas was because the world was comparing ISIS to Al-Qaeda. But Al-Qaeda hid in caves. Hamas runs governments. Hamas has armies. ISIS runs governments. ISIS runs armies. This is a group that is systematically, intentionally eliminating various religious minorities that they disagree with. And they are not asking those that they're killing that are Christian, whether they're Baptist, whether they're Orthodox, whether they're Catholic. They don't ask what seminary you went to, where was your baptism. It is no different, and I can say this with personal experience because of my own family's history in the Holocaust. It is no different than Nazi Germany, where they did not ask if you were Orthodox, Reform, Reconstructionist, or Conservative. You were a Jew. And unfortunately, it took a long time for the world to catch up with what was going on during the Nazi regime. And unfortunately today, the United States is perhaps the least engaged in this. And I say it this way. Why in the world has our UN representative, Samantha Powers, whose dissertation was on the issue of genocide, why has she not led the charge inside of our government? And I say our government, Republican or Democrat, it does not matter, it is our government. Why is she not the one saying this is genocide? The eradication of Christians in the land where it began. But there's a reason. And the reason is, once that designation is made, it triggers international obligations. But my goodness, if there was ever a time to trigger an international obligation, it would be right now. The number, Mimi, you gave was 100,000. Yeah, 100,000. The reports are that that is a representative figure. It could be much higher. There's an issue of compassion. People are fleeing. And Europe doesn't know what to do. And the United States doesn't know what to do. And look, we were slow to admit Jews during the Nazi regime. Very slow. There is a problem, though. And it is a serious one. And we are in a church. And we are to show the love of Christ coming out. That's what we are. So the gospel is good news. We should be caring for those widows, orphans. Here's my concern. One of the things that we do at the ACLJ is we have a center called the Oxford Center for the Study of Law and Public Policy, and we deal with issues not so much from a legal standpoint, but from a public policy standpoint. Now, they intersect, obviously. So we do studies, demographic studies, migration studies. We participated this past year at one of the colleges on a series of migration lectures, and the problem coming out of this current situation in Syria. I wish I could tell you the lecture was on the problem coming out of Syria. We thought that's what it would be. This is where the academy needs to catch up with the real world. They were talking about studies from issues 20 years ago where people were fleeing their homeland. She said, I've not done studies on the current situation. We are at the University of Oxford. Could they not find someone who put together a demographic study? So we did. And we looked at the demographics coming out from the UN's own agencies. Christians are being exterminated in Syria and Iraq. We know that. We know that other religious minorities are being exterminated. We know that there is a huge wave of people fleeing. But there's a fascinating dynamic. The in-region numbers, people that are, say, leaving Syria and Iraq, break down in what's usually called normal migration patterns. 35 to 40% female, 20 or 30% children, the lesser percentage male. And in region, that number follows the UN demographic study. But the migration into Europe has been 72% male coming out of Syria, aged 18 to 35. Now, you don't have to be fellows at Oxford to understand there's a dynamic going on here. There is a real enemy. And whether it's called ISIS or radical Islam or jihadists, let me give you a definition that is not politically correct. But I am not a politically correct guy. No. I think the difference between the jihadist, and let me go through the whole explanation before people start gasping. The difference between the jihadist and the moderate is patience. The jihadist has no patience. The moderate does. Now, they are to be distinguished from the reformers. Those inside of Islam that want to see it reform. Those are the people I deal with on a regular basis, both on broadcast and in our work. So I work with Muslims. We've employed Muslim lawyers in region to work on cases. But these are the reformers. Because for the moderate or the jihadist, they don't look at the reformer as a Muslim. I saw a figure the other day. Because of the political season we're in, there's a lot of discussion. And the person said, I don't like when this particular candidate for president said we should ban all Muslims coming to the United States. And I think that, that could be a whole nother lecture. But the thing that caught my attention was not what Mr. Trump had said and what this person was responding to during the presidential debate, but was the statement that the newscaster made on CNN afterwards saying, well, look, it's reported that only 20% of the world Muslim population would want to live under Sharia and would have a jihadist tendency. You mean 20% of 1.8 billion people? Now, in World War II, with the Allies against the axis of evil, we had about 1 million soldiers engaged in conflict, maybe a little bit more. We're talking about 360 billion? Million? Billion, excuse me, million. 360 million, you're talking huge numbers. But putting the numbers aside, it's the political control that is the problem. And that's where we have to lead and call what's happening what it is. It is genocide. I've looked at 7 different definitions of genocide. I will not bore you with them. They're all basically what I gave you. But under any definition of genocide, what's happening right now is genocide. You know, we don't have genocide in the United States. But I want you to think about this evil for a moment. Think about this evil. The evil that of all the nations of the world, we're the only ones that say you can engage in an abortion after the child is a 20-week term. We say that. We're the United States of America. You know, that may not fit the International Tribunal's definition of genocide, but I believe it is genocide. So if you could add the unborn to this list, that's a form of genocide. But let me take it a step further. Once you identify the problem, what are you going to do about it? And I think it is now the job and role of the mediating institutions, the churches, the religious leaders, and Your Eminence has been at the leadership on this, the archons, other laity groups within other denominations, speaking out on behalf of our brothers and sisters who are being wiped out because they follow the Nazarene. I mean, realize, I see some of you wearing the pin. It's the Arabic N. In World War II, before World War II, during the early days of the Holocaust, what they used to do is have the Jews wear a Star of David or spray painted their house with the Star of David. So what does ISIS do? Spray paint the homes of the Christians the same way, with the symbol, the Nazarene symbol. This should not come as a shock, by the way, that they're using Nazi-like techniques, because, truth be told, during World War II, Yasser Arafat was in league with Adolf Hitler. That's not fable, that is fact. Now, one could say that these groups have taken genocide to a whole different level. And I only believe that's true because we see it. We saw the ashes in Dachau and Auschwitz. We see the beheadings on TV and on YouTube. Have you watched one? Have you seen one? Have you seen the Arab Christian led out on a beach and then their head placed on the side of their body by ISIS? Now, I got to ask you this. Does anyone believe that is in this room today, that the United States military could not eliminate ISIS in 30 days? Of course we can. But it's very hard to fight an enemy you refuse to acknowledge. So when you're dealing with the issue of genocide, we have to be first in line. We shouldn't be waiting for global consensus. We should be leading global consensus. The tragedy today is ISIS is a growing threat. Our military testified last week that we cannot contain ISIS under our current strategy, whatever that strategy is. We're in a war. When you're in a war, diplomacy should be part of that. But I suspect Khalif Ibrahim is not going to sit down in Vienna or in Versailles or in Paris or on a U.S. naval ship and sign a peace treaty. We have seen this war with Islam before. We are seeing it again. Now, their excuse is that the United States and the West are the occupiers. the conquering powers. So we try to play a political game. The United Nations passes resolutions. What's the impact of the resolutions? Well, let me make it very clear and very personal. Because I handled a case that is a once-in-a-lifetime case. But this is who's being impacted. An American, born of Iranian descent, a Muslim. One day in his home in Iran, Jesus comes to his bedroom. That is the testimony that Saeed Abedini gave. That Jesus came to his bedroom. We talked at lunch. That so often, that is what we hear. We view it as the majesty of God, the Holy Spirit. But Jesus came to his bedroom, and he became a Christian. Eventually came to the United States, had a burden for his people in Iran, went back to Iran after 9/11, well after 9/11, 2009, to build orphanages. And while he was building orphanages, he was arrested and charged with violating the national security of the Islamic State, the Islamic Republic of Iran. His name is Saeed Abedini. He has served jail in Iran for 3.5 years. I never met Saeed Abedini, but we got a call from his family saying, "Can you help?" And we did help. And then the United States said we were going to negotiate with Iran. And I said, the moment has come. Because a leader would say, before we sit down and talk, the prisoners, the hostages I called them, have to be released. But the Iranians didn't do that. And I went to the White House and I went to the Secretary of State and I said, with due respect, the Americans should be released as a precondition to these very dangerous talks. It's a separate issue. We are the United States of America. My grandfather Shmulek came on a boat. How many of your families in here came on a boat? And came through that state? Everybody in here almost. Passed the Statue of Liberty or went through Ellis Island. And we couldn't demand the release of the hostages. Now, ultimately, after we released $150 billion worth of aid and assets of the Islamic Republic of Iran, which they will use because they are the largest state sponsor of terrorism, to attack our allies. The Arab Gulf states will be attacked. Israel, of course, will be attacked. The Americans come home. They get released. First conversation I had with Saeed Abedini, I'll never forget it. He said, "Jay, what a terrible deal." And he was the guy released. And you know what? I'm glad he's released. I'm glad the others are released. But let me tell you something that happened in that jail and why we have to fight for the truth and the power of the gospel. I got a call from another one of the hostages. Actually, it didn't get to me. I was in trial in a case in Georgia. But this particular hostage was the fourth Iranian American that was held that we didn't really know about in the media. And then they said, there was a fourth one, the businessman. And he called and spoke to one of our law partners, because I was in court, and said, "I just need to tell you something." And he goes, "I've been a Muslim my entire life. But as we were trying to get out of Iran," and that was an ordeal in itself, and I'd need a lot more time to explain what it was like for them to leave. Those last 10 hours were unbelievable. Getting them out of Iran, incredible. We owe a debt of gratitude to the Swiss, but it was a harrowing time. But he said, "Here's what your client did. Your client came to me in our rooms in the Swiss embassy. The first night they had not been in jail for the businessman in 8 months, for Saeed Abedini almost 4 years. And he said, 'I want to tell you about Jesus.' And this guy called skip bash from our office and say, I became a Christian that night because of Sayyid Abedini. And we know it wasn't because of Sayyid Abedini. We know that it was the Holy Spirit drawing him. The point is that in the midst of this persecution, there is still hope. When did the church grow the most and spread? During times of persecution. I want to conclude, because I know we won't have time for questions, with some comments Dr. Kahneman made reference to yesterday. I want to expand it a little bit. We talk about sacred spaces and the conversation about, well, did the Jews, for instance, really need Jerusalem? Did the Turks, shouldn't they get control of their own properties, and that means the ecumenical patriarch and the patriarchate, the monarch, should just move to Brooklyn? What's the big deal? I mean, after all, how many Greeks are left in Turkey? 3,000? That misses the whole point. The Holy See did not leave Italy during the regime of Mussolini. It was a nation state. They had a state status, but they protected that state. We can't, you give up sacred space, and in a very real sense, you're losing part of yourself. So for the Jews, it's the Western Wall, which was called the Wailing Wall. For the Orthodox, it's the Patriarchate. For the Catholics, it's the Holy See. For Americans, not looking at it from a religious perspective, it's Washington, D.C. So why did the terrorists attack Washington, D.C. and New York? The symbols of power. Why did they want to put a mosque? And I'm in favor of religious freedom. Anywhere you want to build a mosque, if it meets the zoning laws, it's a free country. But why on the ground of 9/11? Why? Well, I'll tell you why. Conquest. Cordoba. I could give you the list throughout Islamic history. Now, the reality is, we were the lawyers in that case, and we won the case on a technicality. They didn't comply with the zoning laws because we're Americans. You didn't comply with the zoning laws, you don't get to build your mosque. But isn't it ridiculous? Isn't it ridiculous? Isn't it ridiculous? Ridiculous. That to rebuild the church, the Orthodox Church, on the site of Ground Zero, 12 years to get the approvals. Yet they first pass on the Islamic Center of Manhattan was a one reading at the zoning hearing until we got engaged and messed it up for them a little bit. But you know, buildings are buildings. They're important. It is sacred space. But the reality is people are people. And these are human beings. This is mankind. This is the Imago Dei. This is the very image of God. And they're being exterminated because they believe in Jesus. And the question I ask you as we leave this place, what are we going to do about it? What are we as Americans, as Christians, as believers, and for that matter as non-believers, are we going to sit back and say, yes, this is a terrible thing? Or are we going to leave this place different and saying we have to engage it? I am so encouraged, Father, that you're doing this on a grassroots basis. Because once you're at Oxford and talking about it, it's one thing. But when we can talk to you all, so that you can tell our government next week, when this vote comes up, we have the right to petition the government for redress of grievance. We talk about the First Amendment. We talk about free speech, freedom of association, freedom of religion, free exercise of religion. Part of that First Amendment also is the right for the people to petition their government for a redress of a grievance. Friends, we have a grievance. Our brothers and sisters are facing annihilation in the Middle East. And our government needs to be leading that charge and at least come to the recognition that it is genocide. There is an admonition. There's an admonition in Scripture about this, but there's also one of my favorite parables is the parable of Luke 18, the parable of the unjust judge. And this woman wanted justice so badly that she went to the house of the judge and knocked on his door. Now, I got to tell you something. I've wanted justice too, but I don't go to judges' houses and knock on their doors. But this woman in Israel, I can see my mother doing this. This woman wanted justice so badly she knocked on those doors, that judge, and that judge didn't fear God and he didn't fear man and he didn't care about that woman. She kept knocking. He didn't fear God. He didn't fear man. She kept knocking. Finally, that woman drove him crazy. That's my version. And the judge opened the door and she got justice. And what did Jesus say? How much more will our Father do for us if we petition him? So let us leave here with a petition of prayer, a petition of Congress, a petition of the world, that we as fellow believers and as Americans will not tolerate genocide in our lifetime. Thank you very much.
Dr. Sekulow, we give you our profound thanks for that wonderful presentation. Dr. Sekulow? Okay, I'm so sorry. I apologize to all of you. We thank you profoundly for that wonderful presentation. And I want to remind all of you to please write your questions. You have those cards, and the ushers are going to come and collect them. So that we can ask some of the questions that I know you must have after that wonderful presentation. And now it's my pleasure to introduce our Institute Chairman, Harry Dimopoulos. Dr. Harry, as he is affectionately known, is surely the engine behind this season's series of lectures, which all of you have attended, learned from, enjoyed, and most of all, supported. Our thanks to you, Harry Dimopoulos, for your devotion to this important message that St. Catherine's has brought to our community. Harry's career has included the opportunity to travel extensively, to live in different cultures, to build his company's significant business, and to serve as he does here in each community that he and his wife, Carol, have called home. His many interests include the history of the Byzantine and Ottoman empires. He serves as an active member of this parish, where he volunteers in various ministries. And most importantly, as we gather here today, he serves as chairman of the Christian Rights and Freedom Institute in Naples. Please welcome Harry Dimopoulos.
Wow. What a speech. Thank you so much, Jay, for those inspiring words. And I believe no one here will be surprised when our next president nominates you to the Supreme Court of the United States. Ushers, please collect those questions. I'll lead the Q&A, and I take the chair's privilege here and ask the first question, if I may, until I get those questions from the audience. Mr. Sekulow, Dr. Sekulow. Jay's good. You know the European Parliament has adopted the term genocide. You just told us about it. What will it take for the politics to step aside in the interest of freedom for the U.S. Congress to adopt similar language?
I think it's going to take the American people expressing outrage that we haven't. When I said the petition, look, we've had 400,000 signatures on a petition, and we're just one of many groups on this. But I think the churches have to start speaking out, and they are calling it what it is. But there's a political reality that we're having to deal with. It's a political dynamic in Washington that is, let me tell you, leaving Washington, it's nice to be in Naples. I mean, it's difficult. But I think it's a challenge we have. Congress, I believe, is going to pass that resolution. I believe the House will next week and the Senate probably the week after. I believe it will sit on the president's desk, though, for a long time because he doesn't want to trigger those international obligations. And I think that's horrific. I think that could end up being the legacy of this administration if the administration is not careful. And then it becomes our legacy. Because Republican or Democrat, it doesn't matter. It's our legacy. We're the Americans. So I think we have to be cautious and concerned about it. But this is the time to call Congress, like this week, and then start flooding the White House. That's how. I'm going to stay right here so I don't get up and down.
Now, I will urge all of you, if you're subscribed to a subscriber to ACLJ, to get the weekly, or sometimes more often, emails. Yesterday, you would have received an email on this very subject that says, click here, take you to the aclj.org website, and you can sign your petition. 400,000 people so far have signed the petition. So sign up to LCLJ to get emails and sign the petitions. This is how we have our wish come true. Thank you for that. Any questions yet from they're being worked on? So let me ask you the next question.
Yes, sir.
I have a few.
Yes, Doctor.
Thank you very much. How can the USA stand by and watch the flood of refugees, many of whom are escaping religious persecution, and not defend their Christian rights?
So the difficulty is, and I mentioned this at dinner last night, so there was this, of course, ISIS is controlling territories inside of Syria where they're actually running the government. So someone was saying, some of these Syrian refugees that are coming in on fake passports. Well, the reality, it's not a fake passport. It's a real passport used for fraudulent purposes. But ISIS is controlling these government councils. So the problem is here, identifying who these people are. We have to be right 100% of the time. They have to be right once. So while I think that my immediate concern for those that are in crisis in the region is in-region aid. There are safe zones in region. Look, during the Holocaust, Jews were primarily where? Poland, Austria, Germany, Russia. There were no safe zones inside of Europe to get to. So that's why you saw the migration out. Now, ultimately, once we can verify and know who the people are and look at the migration patterns and do that kind of thing. Right now, we're relying on the UN to certify someone is legitimately getting refugee status. The problem is the UN says they cannot, because of the documents, they can't do their job. And the FBI director said he can't either. So I think right now, in-region aid, which is what's better for these people anyways, because ultimately, we want them to go back to their country of origin and reestablish, look, we're not going to have Jeffersonian democracy, okay? A constitutional republic in Damascus. I think that's we're Americans, we tend to think that because it worked here, it doesn't work there. A friend of mine who's Egyptian Coptic said, Egypt, we have pharaohs. Sometimes they're good, sometimes they're bad. But we've had pharaohs since the beginning. And in a sense, it's true even now. And we shouldn't try to take our form of democracy and say it's going to work in Syria. I will say this, however. I believe every individual, every person is in the image of God, desires freedom and liberty. We need to mold that freedom of liberty in region. Now, if there was in fact a way to verify, I'm not, by the way, I don't think we should ban Muslims from entering the United States. But I will tell you this, when Donald Trump said that, interestingly, I don't think most people gasped in reality. I don't. Because I still can't get my hands around and my head around the idea that in San Bernardino, California, a group of fellow employees of a county government gave a party 3 weeks before for the birth of a newborn child to this family, and 3 weeks later, he killed them in the conference room at a Christmas party. Now, I don't understand that. So, let's be careful. I won't answer each question with that much, because I'll blow the speakers. I don't want to do that.
Continue to show that the emotion.
Yes.
All right, here's one from the audience here. You've been doing your good work over a number of presidential administrations. Which administration experienced the most serious threats in modern times? Why do you think that is?
Well, serious threats in modern times, in administrations I've worked. We have worked with, we go all the way back to George H.W. Bush. A long time ago. There were threats. I still think that the greatest threat that we witnessed as a country was 9/11, and I say that as someone that lived in Washington then and has offices in Washington. We bought our building in Washington, D.C. and closed on it right after it happened. And my son was a student at, my oldest, Jordan, was a student at George Washington University, and the plane that went into the Pentagon flew 400 feet over their building. I remember that day. And I saw something firsthand. I will never forget it. Let me, if I can, repeat it from some that I had dinner with last night had already heard this, so I beg your indulgence. The Attorney General of the United States called me, and I was known as the religious liberty litigator. I wasn't a national security lawyer because we really didn't have a national security apparatus for lawyers. But the Attorney General of the United States called me on September 14th and asked that I come to his office in the Department of Justice in Washington, D.C. And General Ashcroft was there with Michael Chertoff, who later became the Secretary of Homeland Security, Alberto Gonzales, White House counsel, me, Ed Meese, former Attorney General under President Reagan, Boyden Gray, former White House counsel to President George H.W. Bush, and Kenneth Starr, former Solicitor General of the United States. And that we were in the room, and he said to us, in a few minutes I'm going to bring in my career heads of the various divisions of the Department of Justice. Andy's worked with the Department of Justice, I've worked with the Department of Justice, the heads of these divisions. But I want I'm asking you to make this point clear. The world is not the same on September 14th as it was on September 10th. So at that point, the biggest concern was expired student visas from countries that were suspect, primarily then Saudi Arabia. There were thousands of students with visas that had expired that had not left the country, and the Attorney General of the United States and others wanted to figure out where these people were. And I'll never forget this. So the conversation, how are we going to deal with this? And the Civil Rights Division lawyer said, well, you know, if you start questioning like this, we're going to get sued. And Ashcroft said, sued? Sue me. Because, it was an existential threat had happened. The threat became a reality. President Bush told John Ashcroft, never again will that happen. Now, I will say that President Obama's had an equally difficult challenge. It hasn't had the domestic ramification that we've had here, but it is a challenge. And that is the policy that was enunciated, which was this disengagement from the region, which, we've never done it in any other war we've been engaged in. My goodness, we still have troops in South Korea. We still have troops in Germany. We still have troops in Japan. In fact, we don't let the Japanese have an army. Why in the world did we think we could leave the Middle East and everything would be okay? So we did. We just left. And that's what created the rise of ISIS. So the rise of ISIS was, I think, the United States policy helped establish that caliphate. Not intentionally, but omission resulted in that. Long answer to a very direct question.
Thank you for that. I think here's a good one, I think, to remind ourselves. And the question is, can you draw up a petition that we can all take and get signatures and send back to you?
Just go to, it's that simple. It's a one-click, aclj.org. Hit the petition section. It's right there. You can't miss it. And I think it's actually on the homepage right now. So you just go to ACLJ, and it's name, address, and then we send that out to Congress by congressional district. So they don't know that it's just 400,000 people. They know it's 20,000 people from this district, this county, and so forth. So that's the easiest way, aclj.org. And then I'd urge you to call your member of Congress. Call their office. You don't have to speak to the congressman or congresswoman. Just call them. Call the office and say, vote in favor of the genocide recognition.
Another good question. If ISIS can be designated an organization practicing genocide, can the world prosecute their financials and supporters, i.e. Turkey, Saudi Arabia, and Qatar, of the same crime?
Well, there is an aspect of supporting acts of genocide are also crimes under international law. But the mere designation here will trigger a lot of other things which are positive. Now, let me say something about Turkey in that regard. Turkey is running the black market oil that ISIS is operating to the tune of $2 to $4 million a day. The only thing that brought Turkey back to the table, you understand this, was that the incursion of Russian jets into Turkish airspace. This was the reluctant NATO partner. This was we know where Turkey's going now with Erdogan. What brought them back kind of to the table? Why did they reestablish relationships, for instance, with Israel, which were completely severed? Now they're back in full diplomatic relation. Why? How long have the Russians and the Turks been fighting? And they still are today. Except the lethality is a lot more dangerous. So that's what brought Turkey back. But they're still running the black market oil. I think you got to cut the oil supplies off. I've always said that. And I think the reality is part of your broad force includes economics. Choke off the money. It's hard to be a terrorist. You can be an individual terrorist. It's hard to be a movement.
Okay, here's another one. I think it's worth repeating. You mentioned a lady's name. It's not Sandwich. Samantha Powers, our UN ambassador, that wrote her dissertation on genocide. What can we do to encourage her to drive our efforts to fight genocide of Christians?
I would tell you this. Read her book first.
And for our government to lead the charge.
Okay. So read her book. Read Samantha Powers' books. She lays it out. And then just write her office at the United Nations, it's the U.S. Embassy at the United Nations, and say, I read your book. Why aren't you doing this? All of these things matter. She has, in most recent interviews, she's almost said it. Hillary Clinton has said it. She said, now the evidence is clear this is genocide. Yeah. I would say this. I would even, if they wanted to say now the evidence is clear it's genocide, I would take that as a win. Okay? We don't have to say you got it wrong and now you're getting it right. No. Right. The evidence is clear. I'm a lawyer. I deal with evidence. Okay, fine. But that will trigger the obligations. But we are in the 2 weeks where it's going to count right now. Really. Certainly before the summer.
And this will be the last question I'll address to you, Jay. What is the most often brought question or issue to ACLJ? What are you most often asked to defend?
Like living in Naples, it's seasonal. I know the clergy can relate to that. Those of you have parishes here and churches here. It does depend. Look, in 1990, we were worried about could Mary Sue have her Bible club on a public school campus, and we went to the Supreme Court of the United States, and we were, by God's grace, we won that. You know what? Those were easy. Okay? Those were layups. 9-0, 8-1, 7-2. Most of them 9-0. Important. And if you would have asked me 15, 16 years ago, I said in the 1990s, I said those religious liberty cases, those were the cases. And they have had a huge impact, no doubt. We're fighting on a whole different plane now. That was the warm-up. That was like practice on how to do it. We're not litigating it. I've done a case. We've done a case at the International Criminal Court in The Hague. I was taking a course at the College of London, and it was on procedure at the International Criminal Court in The Hague. And you submitted a paper, and I submitted the paper, and the professor at the university, the College of London, wrote me back and said, "Why are you submitting a paper? You've got there's only been 6 cases at the ICC. You have one of them." But the tribunals are different. It's the Supreme Court on some of these issues. It's the court of last resort. But on others, it's the international tribunals. We've had to engage the international tribunals, and we've done that. So there you go. Thank you.